Guys. Good morning, everyone who joined, and also our panelists here on this very, very important topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we're going to have some great discussion today with Dr. Maritza Barros and Kaylin Arrington. And I'm Aaron Moore, and I'm looking forward to seeing you guys put some stuff in the chat. Provoke some thought and really, dive into this conversation of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Maritza Barros is an author of next slide, please. Thank you. Is an author of an ebook on how to thrive on a PWI, 8 Key Factors. She's a proud mom of 2 and happy, blessed human being. Risa is also an inaugural full-time nurturer in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and is in a leadership program at Tufts University, Northeastern University. She got her doctorate from Northeastern University. Sorry, Maritza. And a focus on organizational leadership, and her scholarship focused on lived experience, and she is the Chief Diversity Officer at PWIs in the Northeast. And we also have Kaylin Arrington. Kaylin Arrington is an HCH public consultant and health professional with equity as the basis of what she does and how she works for HCH. She's interested in individual health, education, and policy work, and is particularly passionate about working with resilient people living in vulnerable communities. And with that being said, guys, let's just dive right on into it. If you have any questions, make sure you put them in the chat. We will get them answered, and be on the lookout after for us to email out this deck and the recording of this webinar and the link to YouTube. Dr. Barros, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you so much. Such a pleasure to be here. Thank you to HCH also for the invitation to be part of this conversation. Of course, discussing sense of belonging in the workplace is extremely important, not only obviously to the bottom line of the company, but also to the lived experiences of the people who work for the organization and those in which they serve. So I'm super excited to talk about the different ways in which we can create that, help to attract new talent, and really focus on the culture that exists within our organizations and how it's impacted and influenced by the cultures that we bring from outside the organization. So thanks again for having me here, and I'll pass it to Kaylin.
Yeah, I'm really excited to dive into this topic with you and be here with everyone. And I think we should just get started. So I think the goal of a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in the workplace, including trainings and coachings and things like that, is ultimately so that their workforce does have a sense of belonging. Before we dive into that, should we just kind of get started with defining or discussing what diversity, equity, and inclusion look like in the workplace?
Yeah, definitely. I think shared agreements and language is critical to the actions we take and behaviors that we exude in the workplace. And one word I would absolutely add to the DEI, acronym is that of justice. For me, justice represents the action that will follow the awareness and acknowledgement, right? That taps into accountability and creating real change. So I think that's important. When I think about diversity, equity, inclusion, just in its language, I do think it's important to spend a lot of time on the equity piece. Because it is one area that I think tends to not get as much focus, because we want to see, right? We want to have the representation. We hear that a lot. Representation is very important, it's very critical to be able to represent what the community looks like. But you also want to make sure that all employees, regardless of how we represent have a level of culture competency to really work towards the equitable changes, which for me deal with the historical legacies that we've inherited that continue to perpetuate unfair treatment or just unlikely treatment and experiences in the workplace. How about you, Kaylin?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great summary. And I just want to go back to something you said about justice, because justice is really important. And I think oftentimes when we talk about justice, people think it's these big acts, right? Justices are these big acts, but justice can also show up in really small acts of resistance as well, right? And even, for a lot of people of color who have historically been overworked and are told, that they have to go above and beyond and do extra, justice can look like rest as well. Yes, yes. And, also representation, people, as you're saying, they do talk about representation, but often representation can turn into tokenism, right? We have, yes, we checked a box for the one Black man and the, white women in leadership, and, we have someone who's Latinx, and, our CEO is openly gay, or whatever it may be. But it can very easily go into tokenism when you're looking to those people to speak for the entire group and be representative of an entire group of people. And also when they're not brought in and included at the table in key decision making.
Right. And I'll just, to sort of wrap up this introductory part of the definitions, I would say that it's important as managers and people who are leading teams in organizations to understand that there are different strategies for each of these pathways, if you will, right? There's the diversity, equity, inclusion, and I would include belonging in there, because I see that wanting to be lifted in places where it's diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And it's really a doubling down on that inclusion piece. And then the action, the justice is the piece that moves to accountability, assessment, and just really sort of keeping our knee on the neck, as you would say, to really make sure we're creating the change. And sometimes it does intersect. So I just wanted to name that so we know that it's not like a one size fits all type of strategy or approach to creating culture of belonging and inclusion in the workplace.
And I
That's
would
great.
also
And
like
I
to,
think,
I'm sorry, Kayla. I would also like to pose a question to the group. And you can just put it in the chat. In your current role at your current company, do you feel like you belong? Do you feel like they do a good job of creating a equitable and diverse place to work? And do you feel like they can improve? And if so, what are some things they could improve? So let's get some people talking in the chat while Kaylin and Maritza continue to talk, and we'll get those questions answered. But let's see how many people feel that they have a diverse and equitable and belonging workplace that they're currently in.
Great question, Aaron. And I love that you're asking the audience that while we speak. But Kaylin, you weren't speaking, so I'll let you.
no, yeah, exactly. I just as Aaron said, and do we have a poll for people, a poll question as well for people that don't want to discuss in the chat?
I believe we do, and we'll drop a poll out, and you guys can vote. You can pick your answer, and we'll let you know what those results are.
Oh, there we are.
Poll is open. Everyone, just take a few minutes to go in and answer the simple question. Do you feel like your unique characteristics are welcomed and celebrated? Yes, no, sometimes. All right, about 20 more seconds on the poll, guys. All right. So Chelsea, do we have the results for the poll?
We do. So 85% voted, 48% said yes, 13% said no, and 39% said sometimes.
That's awesome. I mean, that's probably pretty accurate percentages of how people feel in general at their workplace. So, Dr. Barrows, do you have any feedback on that?
Well, let me just see. Oh, 46% said yes. So that's great. Almost half the folks here, at least. And the sometimes feels really accurate to me, and it feels natural. But I wonder if post-pandemic activities and initiatives and investments that have happened around the area of DEIJ have contributed to the 49% or 46% who do feel welcome and celebrated. And if we can go back to the other slide, because I think these are the elements and ingredients that are shaping these responses, right? When we think about unconscious bias, microaggressions, these elements naturally come into the workplace with us because we're human, right? And as I say, human, and that's HUEMAN, because we all come from different hues. But we're all one people, we're one race. But we have been conditioned and raised, educated in a society that does have a hierarchy. And we naturally bring that into the workplace, right? And so I think that when we're not intentional as organizations and managers in not centering these unique attributes and uniqueness of unique cultural elements that come into the workplace, then we lose the opportunity to create that welcoming space, but also celebrate and create opportunities for folks to engage across difference as well. So I think it's important that we do discuss strategies to address unconscious bias. What are the type of activities we should be doing as individuals, as well as what type of resources we should be providing as organizations to help our professionals, in essence, do this work, develop professionally in that manner through the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Dr. Burroughs and Kaylin, what are some ways that organizations can kind of, gauge where they're at and, what goals can they set? Are they meeting their goals in DEI, J? And, what are some goals that you've seen organizations set so far during your, time working on DEI?
I can't see Kaylin or you, Aaron. I don't know if y'all can drop that screen.
Hey, Chelsea, I don't know if you can go back to the webinar slides. All right. Maybe a little technical difficulty here. However, Dr. Bells, again, some goals that you see organizations setting, how they meet them. Can we talk a little bit about that?
For sure, for sure. So I have, in my career in this growing field, I have been a part of, I have been in inaugural roles, honestly, throughout my entire career prior to moving into teaching in this role. And what your question is, what are organizations doing? And I think what we see and what folks might be able to relate to is the action of hiring a chief diversity officer or vice president of equity, inclusion, and what have you. There's all kind of names. Or maybe it's an establishment of a task force or a committee to be able to start, taking the onus of doing this work. And for me, I think a hire, of course, in some form or fashion structurally is going to be necessary to all organizations because these practices haven't existed, right? And so in order for us to infuse them and let them become a part of everything that we do, and so instead of thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion as a separate entity, you think about how do we bring a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens into the existing structures. But before you can get there, you do need the structures to help, build from the bottom up. And I think the first thing any organization should do prior to doing that, especially the parties who have the power and responsibility to hire, is really understand the needs of the organization and what it is that they're looking for, who it is that they're looking for. Not a unicorn, not one person who can do it all, but think about the needs of the organization and the community in which it serves to determine the best structure to do this work. Because there we go. Good to see your faces. And Caitlin, please jump in here.
Yes. I think that, you're exactly spot on. And often companies will hire a chief, diversity officer, but that person should not work alone. That person should have a team working with them, and that person should have top level leadership support. And if we could go back to the last slide before this for a second as well, Dr. Barros, you talked about unconscious bias, and I think unconscious bias is really important, but that puts the onus on the individual, right? To kind of address their unconscious bias, you need to address, systemic bias as well. People often say like racism, sexism, homophobia, it's in the groundwater, right? It's part of our history, really. And all systems have been, created in that history and with that lens. So we need to really address systemic bias as well. And microaggressions, I hear so often from people in the chief diversity officer role that they experience microaggressions on a daily basis, and that they just feel like they're all alone, and so just kind of really, it's also relying on other people who might not explicitly be in those roles to call out these injustices when they see them as well.
And that's where the J is so important in this work, because it's not about the people per se. It's about the community, the issues, the standards of engagement in community. And I love what you just shared, because it helps me it reminds me to bring out the framework that I use in my consulting work, which is that there's 3 levels to this work, right? There's the individual level, your spheres of influence, and then there's the systemic. And so when we go to talking about actions to take to dealing with DEIJ in the workplace and organizations, we have to recognize that there's a combination of things happening. You don't just need one person to come in and, bring all the resolve. You have to really assess and understand what already exists, what are your gaps, and how are you going to bring in the right people to fill that, honestly, regardless of how they look. And representation is super important, and we need to deal with equity within, the experiences, titles, authorities, and so on and so forth, of all levels of organization is what I'm trying to say. But everybody has their part to play. So you can't think about this as one heroic person who's going to come in and bring us to the, justice, the place of justice. We really have to put our hands and heads together to figure out what do we already have that are strengths to this work, and then how do we fill those gaps, and who are the key players as far as the roles. Because Kaylin, I don't know if you've noticed or if you've seen, and especially come up in my scholarship and research, is that many organizations are hiring these positions without understanding the role in and of itself. I couldn't imagine a CEO hiring a chief financial officer or chief marketing officer and not being clear about what they understand that role to be, what are the measurements of success for a person in this role, and what is the type of characteristics, attributes of a person who would show to be more successful in this type of role. If you don't understand that, how do you make the right hire?
Yes, yes, I have, and this is not an insult. This is really speaks back to the system in which we are, ingrained in us. But I have heard so many organizations and municipalities say, George Floyd was murdered, and that was really scary, and we don't know what to do. And so we need someone to come in and address it without really understanding, what it is they're addressing for their local municipality or for their organization. And maybe we can speak to, so everyone does know what, a chief financial officer is. So it's not necessarily a CEO's fault, right? Or a town manager's fault that they don't know what a chief justice officer or chief equity officer does. So where should they go to learn about?
Well, so that comes to, all hands on deck and all titles at the door, because very often I'm seeing the DEI workshops and trainings coming up heavily in the ground level or mid-level of the organization, and the executive levels, the boards, the trustees are not engaging in the same capacity or intensity as they're expecting the members to do. So I think it goes back to the individual level. And you're right, it is no one's fault, because this is not how we were educated in our society. Well, not all of us, at least.
You said something a while back about having committees and I was thinking of a company I was working with during COVID, and they started creating the DEI committee, and every week they just offered an opportunity for people to speak and talk and just kind of get their thoughts and feelings out and provoke new thought and new initiatives. One week it would be African American or police brutality. The next week it would be women's rights. The next week it would be LGBTQ. And they did that, and they kept that going for about a year. And it actually was one of the best companies I've ever worked for in terms of inclusivity. And it did that because people had an opportunity to speak when they didn't think they could at work. And in front of the owners, in front of the CFOs, in front of the CEOs, and actually were able to dialogue back and forth with them. So, a committee in an organization like that, it goes a long way to really have a safe, belonging place to work for everybody, no matter your race, your sexual orientation, so on and so forth. So just wanted to throw that out there.
No, I appreciate that, Aaron. And it sounds like you had a unique experience because you said that executive members were in the room with you. That's great, because I was going to name committees, task force, any way that you can formally get folks involved is obviously collaborative leadership. Shared leadership is great. You do have to be mindful and intentional about the level of authority and power structures within that committee to know whether it is just a place to sort of create a think tank to develop and brainstorm ideas and strategies. And then how does that committee connect to the actual systems, the practices and policies that are governing the organization? So those have to be intentional parts. And it sounds like that was part of your experience, but tends not to be the case. And so you tend to see a lot of committees that are just sort of spinning their wheels. I know I was a part of a number of them in my professional experience. And so I just want to name that if you're thinking about establishing a committee, make sure it has clear goals and understanding whether or not it's going to be sunset or it's going to continue, and in what capacity. Is it for community building, healing purposes, or is it for action-oriented implementation and a feedback loop from your executive members to your organizational members, and vice versa?
Yeah, and Erin, your experience reminded me of a similar experience that I had during the pandemic, but it kind of had the opposite effect. I worked at an organization, and yeah, after the murder of George Floyd, they called, like an all organization meeting to kind of talk about it and hash out your feelings about it, really. And there were not many people of color there, so we all kind of huddled together and actually felt very uncomfortable because the workplace hadn't necessarily made us feel valued or included prior to that experience. So it's also about creating a safe environment, I think, for your employees, and for these committees should definitely have norms and things like that. A common saying is that change moves at the speed of trust. So it's really important to just team building and things like that as well, and not just discussing diversity, equity, and inclusion, but just all have fun so you can get to know each other on a different level as well. Can go a long way.
Definitely, you see those spaces being created and have been created for years, especially in the corporate realm. They're known as employee resource groups or affinity groups, and especially the use of affinity groups is probably the closest you'll be able to get to a safe space in these discussions as possible. Interest group are another way to engage folks in ways that's not connected to a particular topic, but just things that connect us as humans. So there's different approaches and strategies to do that. An employee professional network is one strategy that I share through my consultant, where this work is all seen and done under this work of professional networking, right? We're here to connect, of course, as humans and people, but we're also here to do a job. And so just as we have to professionally develop ourselves as managers, in different technology and things of that sort, there's this lens of equity and inclusion that also we need to develop. And so what we can't do is think that we can, kumbaya and all come into the same place and find each other at the same level and be able to grow together. I really think that part of that approach in equity is meeting people where they are and creating those opportunities to have these conversations within the constructs, because we recognize that race is a construct. However, we still live in this construct. We're still filling out the census and having to select our boxes. And so we still do have to address those unique experiences based on our designated race, if you will, and then be able to pull people back together once we can get to a level of cultural competency in which especially people of color, Black folk, are not harmed by being in these spaces for others to learn, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I often say cultural humility as well as cultural competency, because cultural competency almost assumes that you're supposed to have a level of competence in all these various cultures, and it's okay to just come to it with a sense of curiosity. You don't have to assume things or read up on cultures. You can also just ask as well.
Yeah, for sure. You should all actually, this, because when we can own and recognize that this is an ongoing journey, we're never going to get to a place of being an expert in these areas. We're always going to be growing. That that means that humility has to follow you, or you carry that humility all the way.
I also think it's important to note that, talking about things, and like George Floyd, I think that's where we started that committee and that program. But, being able to talk and learn about different cultures and how people view the world and view things. It will help leadership in organizations have an understanding and not react or build a perception or have a perception based on what they think, because they actually have an opportunity to learn about those different cultures. And perception in the workplace is a big deal, but who's setting the perception? Who is the one that is driving somebody's perception in the workplace, and do they understand the culture that those employees come from, to be able to give a fair perception, and actually have a reality moment with each and every employee.
Right. It's the beauty of being able to bring your whole self into the workplace. Certainly a privilege for some, but something that some have to really work at and be conscious, and even strip themselves of that necessity to code switch, right? And figure out how to be authentic and be with a company and organization that allows you to be unapologetically yourself. I'm still trying to find, no, I'm just kidding.
I'm going to throw a question out for the audience, or maybe get some action in the chat. But I want to discuss, some common issues, or see if there are some common issues in different organizations, how each employee sees it. So if you have an issue that you may or may not deal with, or you've seen somebody have to deal with, throw it in the chat. Let's see how common some of those issues are. So we can talk a little bit about that after Dr. Burton go through this next slide.
Did you want to start? Because I was excited to talk about DEI training, but I'll let you start off, Caitlin.
No, I go right ahead. This isn't a really exciting topic, but I was gonna say, you did also say something important about ensuring that you're able to bring your whole self to work. And I kind of want to address a common myth, I guess. People think often that only quote unquote minority populations bring diversity into the workplace, right? Like everything else is sort of unmarked, if you will. But everyone brings diversity into the workplace by bringing all their identities. And no one is 100% privileged in all areas, and no one is 100% not privileged in all areas. So we all bring a level of diversity to the workplace, and it is important to ensure that everyone is on board, right? Diversity training, since we're going to talk about that, is not only for example, like the cis heterosexual older white men, right? Diversity training is for everyone, and everyone's unique perspective in the workplace is important. So I'll let you, chime in on training.
Oh my gosh, well, you set that up beautifully, because that is so important. I think part of my background also includes working in higher education, and you can see it in the structures when you see a Center for Multicultural Affairs or the African Studies, Africana Center or something of that sort. And these become safe havens for people who identify as such, without others recognizing that they are also there for their education as well. So we all have to take ownership in the training and the learning. The one thing that I feel, and it came up in my scholarship as well, the one thing that I think the field is missing in its practices is, again, we're trying to create this one size fits all. I'm going to create this 1 2-hour training. It's going to teach everybody everything about historical legacies or unconscious bias, and everybody's going to get it in this one format. And the tool that's missing is some form of assessment. The one that I'm familiar with is called the Intercultural Development Inventory, the IDI. And the IDI allows an organization. There was one chief diversity officer, inaugural chief diversity officer, that I interviewed in my scholarship that was able to actually implement the policy that every person hired in that organization, as part of their onboarding experience, would take the IDI. The IDI would let us know exactly where they are to help us determine what is the training we need to bring to the masses and which are the ones we need to have for a few individuals. You can really personalize the learning track and meet people where they are versus trying to assume that everybody understands. You know, I love what you said about humility, because when I say confidence, I think about the basic understanding of the truths that govern the structures of our society, right? And when we can at least be at a level of understanding our history and truths in those histories, then we can start to learn and grow from each other. And so the IDI lets you do that. The IDI allows you to look at the collective, a unit or a department that might be struggling. Everybody takes the IDI, and then we work with the team to address some training. So you can really tailor, because the biggest thing I see is, you know, wasted time and dollars spent inefficiently. And so I can't stress that enough. IDI, if you haven't heard about it, Google it. It's one of the first things to pop up. It is a practice that I wasn't fortunate enough to have the authority or the time to implement, but through research, I will tell you that it is a powerful tool to help improve, I think, these, you know, DEI trainings today.
I think that is really important. I just want to highlight some consulting work I'm currently doing on behalf of HCH with a major municipality. We did an assessment before doing trainings, because training was our scope of work. So we did assessments and we did interviews with a lot of the staff. And what we actually decided was that they have had several DEI trainings, and you know, but they all needed unique things addressed. And so we didn't think that another training would actually work. And what we did instead is individual one-on-one coaching with some of the staff members. And they're really able to, you know, get their questions answered and grow in a one-on-one environment. So in addition to training, you know, DEI coaching, I think, is less common, but it's definitely, you know, another thing that can be used after baseline training for.
I love that, right? That's universal teaching at its best, right? Where universal design of learning, where you're meeting people in their best ways of learning, and that's being inclusive, y'all. Inclusivity, when you really want to activate that DEI, and it's not just a buzzword. That's when you have the general trainings that work for folks, and then when it doesn't, you're able to pivot and move to a coaching model to be able to support folks at that individual level, and then reconnect them to groups and communities. But that ability to shift and be flexible is, you know, the true essence of inclusion in this work and equity. So don't think that, you know, it's just going to be one strategy or one training. You really do have to think about this structurally and systematically. So I definitely believe human resources is a major key player in partnership with your Office of Diversity, Equity, whatever it is you call it, and make sure that leadership is also taken apart. Just because you have a title and a certain positionality does not exempt you from the need to do this work in this learning as well. And you know your organization best, so you know if those should be separate sessions or if those can be joint sessions, similar to the experience Aaron expressed. And I think that if you have to start separately, that's okay, because eventually you can you'll definitely be able to bring the group together when there's growth and learning with those individuals who've maintained commitment to this work. And I'll say the learning, because education is at the core of all of this, I believe. And the learning doesn't just end in the workplace, right? It's not just when you're in your position and in your role that this is something you engage in. This has to be a part of your life, your personal living, and personal development as well. And it is the responsibility of the organization to also provide these resources to its staff. You cannot just say, because it is out there, the internet, anybody can find any type. I mean, folks can join us here today and start learning. but you do have to take responsibility in creating education hubs. If you don't want to call it an education hub, it's a professional development hub, or some type of structure that really, when folks need it, they have a place to get it. If it doesn't exist, you have the ability to create it.
Maritza, we have our first question from an attendee. How do you find the right fit for a DEI consultant? With some good best practices to find the right fit.
Oh, that's a great question. And I'd love to hear what Kaylin has to offer. I feel like from my perspective, it's still a developing and bursting, emergent sort of field to find people. I'm not sure that there's these central places yet. A lot of word of mouth for sure. Obviously, HCH is gonna offer you some great consulting. I like to think I offer great consulting, but how would you find me, right? I'm honestly not even visible on the website yet. So I would say probably right now the best way is through networking. There is, in the state of Massachusetts, there is a DEI coalition I was a part of when I worked for municipal government. That's a great networking space to tap into people who might be able to offer you some great consultants. Some of the greatest consultants that I've seen out there are also practicing in the field. So they have these full-time jobs and they're consulting. So the expertise becomes limited because there's only so much time, but know that I think that's where it's at for my knowledge at this time.
Yeah, I definitely agree with a lot of that. And, you know, Maritza several times mentioned education. And I think it's important that, and that's another resource, you can go to, you know, local colleges and universities as well, if you don't have, you know, a consultant or network. But the right fit, I think the person or the team that you hire does need to be really engaged with DEI best practices and constantly learning, because things do change all the time. And they also have to be willing to really have the heart of a teacher and you know, coach and go alongside you. They shouldn't necessarily just be speaking at you. They should really understand, and they should, you know, talk about creating sustainability and really embedding equity in everything they do. And I think it can also be helpful when the consultant or consultants have, or it can sometimes be helpful when they look like the population that's kind of being served as well, in terms of race or ethnicity or gender or sexuality or language or even just region, right? It might be better to hire a New England consultant or New England firm if you're located in New England, or be good to have, or at least, at the very least, they do work elsewhere and have an understanding of, you know, the local practices that might influence things in your municipality or your organization.
And I would add to that, don't be afraid to invest in your employees to go obtain certificates. Or at Tufts University, we have a master's degree. I think the most critical, if I'm thinking from my practitioner lens, the most critical skill your team needs to develop to help you save money from consultants. It's probably not a good thing for me as a consultant to say that, but we're talking about sustainability here, and the real, you know, success of developing organizations in this way is your team needs to learn how to conduct an equity audit of sorts and assess, right? They've got to be able to be evaluators and understand what an assessment plan is versus how can I evaluate a service or an experience that I'm providing. So that would be one area. I'll just offer that. So of course, get the go after the consultants, vet them through with what Kaylin suggested, so that they do have some level of compassion and are helping you in a way that it can be a handoff, so that you're not always dependent on a consultant. It can get costly, and this work to transform experiences in people is expensive. So you want to make sure you're being effective with your dollars And so if you can learn how to be I'm thinking about how many of my students coming through the program, that evaluation and assessment skill set is one of the most critical skill sets they're going to leave here with. And in my experience in the practice, it's one of the things we do the least is formal evaluations. I mean, if you even think about how your organization is tracking criteria that would help measure around DEIJ, you'll understand what I'm saying, the importance of this skill set.
Awesome. And as you can see on the slides, everyone, some best practices, some implementation in DEI training in the workplace. Again, you'll be able to see this slide when we send it out and the recording. But, you know, put it to work. You know, the worst you do is say you want to learn about something, and say you want to implement something, and then just sit on your hands. You know, actually, you know, put some effort into, you know, making people feel inclusive. And like Dr. Burrows said, you know, it starts with one person, you know, being able to speak freely and feel included, and then it will start to snowball, right? So just continue to push diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace, and be the one. It starts with one. Be the one that does it every time, every chance they get, and you'll see how it's contagious.
We have to remember the power dynamics that play into all of this, especially in the workplace. So if we can be models as managers and owners, you'll be really surprised at the attitude shifts and, you know, the buy-in from your employees. It's so incredibly powerful, but it's not one, you know, that we see often.
Sorry about that. I want to see if we can open it up for any last questions. It is 8:47 here on the West Coast, and I know it's getting close there for lunchtime for you guys on the East Coast. So any final thoughts and questions for Dr. Burrows or Kaylin before we start to head to close this thing out? All right. I don't see anything in the chat. Chelsea, do you? Nada. All right. So you want to bump over to the next slide for me? I want to give you guys an opportunity to speak about this a little bit, you know, workplace cultural awareness. I think we kind of touched on it and talked about it throughout the dialogue we've had, but any last statements or thoughts that you guys may have on this particular slide about workplace cultural awareness? Okay, Dr. Burrows, good.
Yeah, I will just kind of emphasize how active listening and empathy can really go far in this work. It really starts with that, starts with empathy and being able to put yourself in other folks' shoes and really understand and listen. It's really easy to get, I think, defensive, but as another consultant that we work with, Dr. Sharon Ravitch always says, there's no individual shame in this game. And so I think those are the two things that I want to leave you with really is, you know, there's no individual shame in this game, and fostering a sense of you know, just understanding and empathy can really bring you a long way. Maritza?
What I'd like to offer is this work is not easy, but it does take intentionality and commitment. And I think accountability is one piece that we don't often talk about. And so when we think about our organizations and how to create a culture of belonging, we have to also turn on our external lens, not just think about ourselves in a silo as a microcosmic, you know, being within all these other organizations that exist and the people in the world. Like, We have to know that when the people leave your job, they're going into their worlds. And so in that case, let's think about if George Floyd was, the murder of George Floyd was the thing, you know, actually seeing that, right, in real time was the thing that got us to move and awaken. What's going to keep us going and going to keep the urgency? What's our accountability as an organization to impacting the closing of these historical gaps, right? Historical legacies that continue to exist. What's our responsibility in that accountability and in those reparations? And for me, that looks like contributing to the communities that you reside in as an organization. It's creating partnerships, pathways, and access to developing the people, not just taking the pick of the best picking of the pool that's come out of the, you know, graduations this particular year of these programs, but actually going into the communities and putting dollars into building people from crisis to opportunity, so that you're preparing the next employee, the next VP of your organization from childhood, right? Or from not having a traditional high school diploma and then getting trained. You're involved in training services that get them equipped to be a good employee in your organization. That's the type of accountability I think we need to talk about when we think about recruitment, when we think about diversity and representation. It's not just about taking what's available, but playing a part in taking commitment into helping to develop the future of who's going to be leading our organizations. So I think that's super important and critical, and the best way to do that is through partnerships, local, regional, and even national.
Absolutely. It's important to point out that, this is something that's going to always keep changing. It's going to be something new. And if you create those great habits, like Dr. Burrows and Kaylin are talking about, if something new is added to the game, and you got to, you make a whole another group of people feel belonged, belonging, then you'll be ready to go ahead and do it pretty easily. Because you already have a system in place to do that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, hey, I want to thank everybody who joined. Overall, and as you can see here, DEI is so important in the workplace. We've honed that in. We've talked about it over and over again. Do your part. Starts with one. Do your part. And see the trickle effect and the snowball effect of the people around you. I want to thank everybody who attended. I want to thank Maritza Barros and Kaylin Harrington for speaking, and hopefully had some provoking thoughts with the people that are listening here today. I know I have. I know it was some good information for me. So hopefully we can see a better, diverse, and equitable workplace in each and every organization for the people that join. So thank you very much, Maritza and Kaylin. I want to remind everybody that we do have another webinar on November 7th at 11 a.m. And that will be also about diversity, equity, and inclusion and training for the modern teams, series 2. So hopefully we can have some more attendees, some more speakers, and we can continue to provoke some thought there here out in the communities. Again, Maritza, thank you. Kaylin, thank you. You guys were awesome, and we definitely appreciate you for doing this today.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, folks.
All right.
Thank you, Aaron.
Everybody. Have a good day. Huh?